All right. Welcome all to this week's session of the Full Stack Forum. We're going to be talking today about my line here is to say one of the most abused mechanisms in professional work, but I actually think it's honestly one of the most abused mechanisms in all of life, and that is escalation, or as I sometimes like to put it, the "Can I speak to your manager?" uh, mentality. So, and what we do with it. Um, so, a lot of what we do, we're in fast moving environments. Um, we talked last time about urgency and urgency theater, and today we're going to talk about how that relates um, to escalation or the idea of escalation um, in our work. Because often that source of urgency theater is just trying to get us to make it go faster. We don't want to confuse escalation with intensity. So, in that vein, the first thing I want to do is pose a question to the group. And that question is, recently in your work life, or heck, even in your non work life, think of a recent escalation you witnessed and what made it useful. Like, it could have been something you did, that you got feedback on. It could have been something that you witnessed somebody else do. When you see somebody or you experience this thing where you need to go, hey, I need to put this up, or I need to get somebody else involved. What made that communication, that escalation useful or useless? I will start. The I often think about escalation in everything that I do. But I have been having an experience recently on something I've been working on, where I've had to, me personally, I've had to make the decision to bring it to others higher than me, or even just more skilled and uh, more knowledgeable in the areas that I'm working in. And the decision for me to escalate is always a tough one. I don't like bringing people in and giving them more to do. I run off the assumption that everyone's pretty busy, right? So, in this particular case, okay, I had um, a test environment that we're trying to get fully set up, and I needed to help the QA team to be able to work through this environment and do everything. And in doing it, we found that there's quite a few tools, but the one tool is not really being used too much by the QA team, or there's some unfamiliarity with it. And the person who is most familiar with the tool is someone I very much respect and very much appreciate all the work that he does. Um, but what I did was I took the initial step before just tagging in this massive 100 plus reply Slack thread of what was going on. I took the time to go and send a direct message and be like, "Hey, I got the situation. Here's what we're trying to do." And I kind of just listed it. Here's what I'm trying to do. I'm setting up this test environment, so on and so forth. I am I'm running into an issue here with this tool, or the QA person running into an issue with this tool. I think it may be a lack of knowledge on our parts. And just to be clear, this does not take precedent over anything else. I level set, hey, when you get a chance, I tried to communicate that my sense of urgency in it was not high, instead of leaving it to be unknown. So what made that escalation useful was the fact that I communicated the context, I communicated where I needed help in that, and I communicated what my expectations of a timeline would be, to eliminate that sense of urgency theater. I wasn't trying to make like this is a big deal for me that need to be done right now, but I also wasn't just leaving that open and not communicating what the sense of urgency was. I was being very specific about it. A stark difference in that would be the folks who come to you, not necessarily saying, can I see my manager? Or can I see your manager? I should say, can I see your manager? They're coming to you and saying, oh man, their stress becomes your stress. I really want to get this done. I'm struggling with this. It's been a week. Can you help me out, please? Bro, how does that help me? Like, of course I want to help you, but how does that help? So have you guys seen, like, in your work, past experience, whatever, have you guys seen kind of like situations where it was done the wrong way? And maybe like, what would you like to see as a right way in these types of situations?
Yeah, I've certainly had folks come to me with like it's kind of a mix of like urgency and escalation, like people who come to me with like an issue that seems at based on their tone and energy that they're kind of coming to me, I like immediately sort of like, oh, this must be a pretty big deal. Like I need to kind of drop what I'm doing and take a look. And sometimes there have been cases where yes, this is certainly a problem, and we need to address this sort of ASAP. And there's been other times where that I've dropped what I'm doing to look at whatever problem it is, and either a misinterpretation of the data or an incomplete picture of what is actually going on has led us to actually be like, oh, this is not as large of an issue as we thought it was. This is something that can be triaged, or we didn't properly triage, and therefore now it's like, oh, this actually needs to be de-escalated in priority. Like, yes, this is something that needs fixed, but it's like not as quite as much of a issue as we thought it was or is, and can thus be prioritized accordingly. And in those moments, kind of rather than taking a beat to assess and look at what's going on, I've sort of like taken on that energy of like, oh, like this is an issue, like we need to like maybe run this up the chain, and end up kind of not necessarily sticking your foot in your mouth, but just like, oh, okay, yeah, this wasn't as big of an issue as we thought it was. So
In that situation, TJ, or in those situations, um, especially the ones that kind of went the way of this is not really as big a deal, when presented with those situations, how do facts versus opinions play into those conversations?
I think, yeah, it's sometimes hard to kind of like separate the two, because that person coming to you with the issue, like they feel strongly, and sometimes they feel strongly just because of a misinformed, view. And it's like, oh, okay, I didn't realize this, like I thought this was a much bigger issue. Like, okay, yeah, we're cool to like de-escalate. But then there's other situations where people are, whereas to me, when I look at the facts, I'm like, okay, this is not as big of an issue. That may not be what their opinion is. They like feel strongly about said issue because of downstream effects or whatever it is, for whatever reason they have more buy-in on it, or so it feels bigger, or more pressing to them. So it can be hard to sort of separate those, and kind of like push back, like, yes, like, I understand, like, we care about, our customers, or like whatever it is, but based on the data, this is not something that's a drop whatever you're doing and fix or work on this. We have some other 1A priorities that need to be taken care of before this, like, or and sometimes that can be, we can, what's the word I want to use, placate's not really maybe like the right word, but like we can sort of placate that person by like, okay, well, is there something that I can do in the interim to mediate or lower your urgency feeling? Like, is there a script that I can put together that will fix records in the meantime? And so I'll try and find those ways that I can help them, but this doesn't require me to drop whatever I'm doing and devote all of my attention to.
What any of you, and just feel free to jump in or even raise your hand if thought comes to you in a little bit, but what to any of you makes an escalation to you usable instead of just loud?
Yeah, maybe if I can chime in on that one. I guess an escalation with kind of the data that goes with it, right? Exactly, obviously, what's going on, how long has something been going on? I think that really would help me kind of triage, how to attack something. Maybe one example I had this years ago, where an issue that was brought to me at kind of an engagement with a new client. This is like the number one issue. We have to solve this today. Clients are seeing incorrect numbers in a on a report or something. And I made it my number one priority to fix that issue when it was brought, to me. But then later I found that this had been ongoing for months. Nobody had really been negatively impacted. It was just this person's opinion that this is now a thing that has to be resolved today. Otherwise, pressure was very high. People get fired, if it's not within this time frame. So it would have been useful for me to kind of know that ahead of time rather than jumping right into the solution of the problem, because I wasn't even kind of afforded that discussion, right, without the details, without the information. And so this particular one didn't end as well as it could have, because I think it would have been just a backlog item rather than an emergency. But we treated it as an emergency because of lack of transparency or data, I guess, surrounding the issue.
Right. Yeah. GC, like what's the, I mean, you've been doing architecture for a while now, right? So in your opinion, like that situation,
Mm-hmm.
what was the downstream effect for the business? Like we realize that you personally dove into something, you spent a bunch of time, right? But the business often doesn't realize what the downstream impact is
Yeah.
on these things that they do. So we got one guy who's got a strong opinion, who kind of latches on to this guy who's starting, right? And goes, I'm going to have this dude solve my pet problem, right? What, in your opinion, or what did you see that ended up being a downstream effect of that particular issue for, of that way of escalating that issue?
I mean, this particular one never got solved the way it was supposed to get solved, right? Because if you don't take care to figure out how you want to solve an issue and you jump right into it and you do it in this emergency mode, you're not going to get a good solution that's well tested that you can then roll out to the clients. The actual client impact to kind of your start of your question was minimal, especially if communication would have gone out saying, hey, there's a known issue in this particular area, maybe don't look at these numbers too closely. There is another way in the app to get to those numbers. If you click a little bit further, a workaround of some kind, then that would have bought the time to really solve the issue, test it properly. Another item that I learned later was that this had been attempted to be solved numerous times unsuccessfully. So, again, showing somebody went ahead, tried to solve the problem, they fired it right into production without proper testing, without taking the time to set up test data, right, to make sure those numbers add up to what it was supposed to. So yeah, it really, I guess, ended up taking longer to solve the issue because it was solved multiple times. Multiple people got involved, multiple people tried. The client kept trusting the numbers, right, on every new attempt at fixing it. But presumably that also wasn't ideal for the customer, right? If they get a notification, hey, it's fixed, it's not fixed, still not fixed, right? Every time that the company said it would have been fixed. So yeah, probably some negative impact, more so downstream, right? Reputationally rather than technically in the immediate moment.
Yeah. It's sometimes super hard to, like, those of us who get up to that sort of architectural level where you're doing this high interaction with the business. One of the things you've learned is you end up having to communicate what the downstream effects of this really are, like what you were mentioning, GC, in terms the business can understand, right? Well, you guys just spent, however many of thousands of dollars to solve a problem that wasn't negatively impacting any of your client base, that nobody else noticed. And also, because you were focused on this problem, you lost time on problems that were affecting the customer base. And your updates for the people who did look at it, where this issue wasn't important to them, you've now affected your reputation, and quantifying that is extremely difficult. So,
Yep.
like that sort of comparison to the business is extremely valuable. And I think we see a lot of people, a lot of companies trying to put into place mechanisms to control and understand this. And the simplest mechanism being, hey, our work item tracking system, we have a priority, right? And in order to set something at a specific priority, right, you have to have a number of people or a specific set of people to prioritize that. And there has to be evidence backing the reason for that priority. In this way, you get the has this problem that is being escalated actually been thought about? So that's a really good scenario. I like that. I like to see that there is indeed, issues here with escalation. I think it's a relatively universal situation at companies small and large. How do you it speaks to that prioritization factor. Anyone else have any thoughts on situations where they've seen escalation and what it looked like? Like tell the story. What did it look like, and What was the result? No? Okay, good. I'm going to take that for a minute, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the things we've kind of touched upon through this, through these stories. You know, we as software developers, when we're just doing software development, we're going through the day to day. I don't know that we think about the very technical aspects of raising issues of bringing things higher up. And escalation isn't only for emergencies, right? We can have somebody something as simple as we've worked on a feature, and when we work on a feature and it goes into testing, somebody comes back with a new idea. And so that testing feedback is, can we add this? And it seems super simple. But then we look at it and it's not. It happens all the time, right? TJ, I know you're smiling because we talked about the specific example like a day ago. You know, like that scope increase creates this friction, right? So when you have somebody really high up go, hey, I really want this piece of text here that shows this thing. It's so simple. Just add it. Just add the piece of text. Well, but that piece of text relies upon numbers that have to be calculated further downstream in the process than we're currently in. And the amount of basically CPU we're going to chuck at doing that is dang near impossible to get right. And at the same time, even if we did get that calculation to work, there's still a 50-50 chance that ending number won't be right. And so now what do you do with that? Do you just do what the higher up really wants? I mean, I wouldn't, but I'm also a jerk, right? Like, this, I do this in everyone. I'm wearing my Sandlot, "You're Killing Me" small shirt. This is the epitome of how I act, right? I'm the catcher. I'm going to tell them you're killing me. I will walk right back to the executive and say, "You're killing me, Smalls." Like, do you understand that it's not as simple as it is? And so this can be looked at as abrasive, but it can also be looked at as, I'm willing to go the extra mile to communicate up in some way, shape, or form, whether that be I have a good relationship with somebody so I can say very directly, dude, you don't even know what you're asking for. Or it's a lot more of a professional situation where I'm going, let me ask you some questions. Let me ask some questions because I've thought through the process. And now that I've thought through the process, I'm going to walk you through thinking through the process, but also do it in a way, and a lot of leadership and executives, they don't want to know how we do what we do. So you need to do it in a way that doesn't try to over-explain, which can be a very difficult middle ground to hit. So when we're talking about escalation, we're not just talking about critical emergency situations. Escalation covers anything where you're in the midst of doing something and you need to stop for a second and step back. And so there is a model to this that we can follow. Okay, we need facts. There's no point in going and presenting to leadership or an executive the difficulty of doing something that they perceive as simple if you don't have facts. So when we're escalating, it's part of our job to give facts. You need context. And context is relatively, it's relatively straightforward on the surface too, but also how much context do you give, right? knowing your audience, how much context do you give? What is the uncertainty in this? That's another key piece of information. Okay. In our world, uncertainty is pretty ubiquitous. It's kind of always there in what we do. We don't always know with certainty if we can or can't do something. To a business person, uncertainty is risk. It's always going to be risk. And what they're going to want to know is, how do we mitigate? How do we avoid? How do we accept the four ways that you deal with risk? So if you just reframe for yourself when you're communicating uncertainty, you're communicating risk. That helps. Also, what are our options? Right? I think in the best situation you can have is your options are your how you're handling the risk of that uncertainty. Who's going to own it, and what is the next decision to be made? So I want to kind of talk about those that model. So I'm talking about this as an escalation integrity model from the perspective of you as an individual, right? When you escalate, right? Let's look at this model, okay? And facts, interpretation, uncertainty, options, who's the owner, and what's the next decision. These are all things that can be communicated very concisely to the people you're having to do that with. So as we talk about this model, I also want to talk about like the idea of how early do you escalate versus how vaguely do you escalate. This is, I think in our discussion here, we've talked about the idea that when you don't give all these specifics, when you don't give enough context and information and things like that when you're escalating, it doesn't really matter how early you escalate, because what you're looking for is someone to buy into your escalation, but maybe not giving them enough information. So escalating early it's not that it doesn't matter, it's going to be less effective. So if you can't escalate early because you don't have the facts and you don't know what the uncertainty is and you don't know what the options are, then you should escalate. The appropriate timing for escalation means, within our model, we can escalate when we have facts, interpretation, the risk, and the options. That's when we can figure out who's going to own this, what's going to go on next. That's always how I operate with escalation. I'm not escalating thinking that I'm not going to own this. Obviously, sometimes I know, hey, I'm letting you know about this situation. I need a decision, but I'm still gonna own whether or not we get this decision. And then don't escalate emotion. I know for most of us on the call, this isn't really a problem because as we've talked about here, like I'm sure we've seen like entry-level developers go, I don't know what to do. And that emotion that they have over it brings them to you as a more senior developer or a more senior person. Emotionally, they're escalating it to you, going, I don't know what to do here. And they're actually quite uncomfortable with just not knowing what to do. So when we do it, right, we want to escalate that risk around the facts, the interpretation, of course, the risk I'm talking about, and the options, because that removes the emotion from the equation. I don't want to sound like what I'm saying to y'all is quit being emotional, because that's not what I'm saying at all, right? But we do often not get we often don't get the advice that our emotions have a significant impact on the way that we work. We get told don't have emotions or don't be emotional about stuff at work. Professionality and being professional and being emotional are mutually exclusive. That is absolutely not the case at all. Like, super not the case. I think that's actually a very, I mean, honestly, I think that's actually quite a misogynistic standpoint that stems from the early days, years and years ago, before there was a lot of women in the workplace. So I think that there's a proper place for the emotional side of it, but helping us to work through that or working through that ourselves and seeing it through from an emotional standpoint and then making the choice to be aware of that and responding to it so that you get to the risk and options and the professional side of it so that you can properly manage the emotions in it for yourself. That's the way to go. So what does this look like in reality? Like, what are some examples of escalation strategies that work, or real life things? So how do we, like, status updates are one piece, or that could also be status update could come as an email, but you could also have a specific email or Slack message that says, hey, I need to escalate this. What are, again, opening the crowd, what are some situations and some ways that you've seen people actually functionally do the escalation? What would you guys consider to be acceptable ways to escalate an issue, either from someone to you or from you to leadership executives? What works well in your experience?
Nope. I'll jump in here and kind of circle back a little further back because I kind of was thinking about, you were talking about the idea of like make the quick text change. And of course, the quick text change is never, whenever I hear the words, this will be real quick, I normally shudder because I already know what that means. It's never real quick. But I know you guys are all speaking from the position of like a senior developer or someone right below the executive. And I speak from the position of like a mid-level developer where you're below someone else. So let's say an executive raises the flag that, hey, we need to do a text change. Normally that trickles down. And then in some cases it gets to me with little context other than emergency, do this now. And I try to operate from the point of view of where my position is, and I have no context as to why. So I try to assume the best. Maybe there's a legal reason that this needs to be done right now. No one gave me that context, and I'm not in a position to raise the flag of like, so I'm going to push back to my lead, who's going to have to push back to the executive, and we're going to spend a day arguing, and now I look like the jerk. So I think that's one of those things where escalation, when it gets passed off, especially when it trickles down through multiple people, creates just a series of issues. And there's some trust there that you need to trust the people above you that what they're handing you is serious. But to your point of what makes it work good is when there's a lot of context. Like, we need to add text. Here is why. Legal said that we have the wrong numbers up and we're kind of opening ourselves up to a liability by leaving it here. So this is why it is urgent today. And from my point of view, that explains, okay, now I'm coming in here and I know we need to be serious about what we're doing. There's no doubt in my mind what we're doing and why we're doing it. So I guess that's kind of my 2 cents on it.
That's a really good point. And think about that way, you have this daisy chain of stuff coming down and work to be done. And you're right. In most cases, you don't necessarily have an opportunity to, or at least have the opportunity with ease to escalate things back up the chain. And I think that, like, daily stand-ups do serve a purpose. I'm not a huge fan these days of formal agile processes, right? I get Scrum. I've done the Scrum implementation. My opinion has always been that the Agile Manifesto is really great for understanding how to institute better processes that deliver things faster, but it very much lacks the real perspective of the developer experience in it. And it's been definitely agile methodologies have been usurped by businesses to essentially create, new waterfall. The advent of AI development makes it even more of an issue in that we're actually seeing the software development. Excuse me. We're actually seeing the software development lifecycle be reimagined completely with AI assisted development. So, in the case of there's multiple layers going on here, Joseph, in those types of situations where you are, do you have the opportunity to kind of do postmortems on the work that you do? Okay.
No, I would say that's probably rare. I mean, you know, and it's not a critique of anybody or anywhere I've ever worked, but when you're lower in the chain, it's not really your place. And I don't mean that as like a bad thing. In most ways, again, it comes back to a trust thing because sometimes you just need to let things happen. Um, and I'm trying to think of a great example of this because I've been in both positions. I've been, in past career, the higher up, and in this career, the lower down. But sometimes you need to let people make the wrong call because if you were to question it and push it too hard, you actually create more problems than letting that first failure fail and letting them learn from it and move on. Um, and I've seen those effects happen in real time, where it's like uh, it just creates a lack of harmony with the way people work together, rather than letting someone fail and be like, yeah, I saw that, but I did it anyways. And, we made it through it. And now you're starting to make the right call. So good thing we did that. But I definitely say from my position, no, it's very rare that I have a chance to do a postmortem or have something like that.
Yeah, it's funny because postmortems are supposed to be done in most cases. If you're following any sort of agile methodology, like the postmortem is a standard, right? And I actually tend to concur with you in most of my work experience. That's not done, right? And even if it is done, the developers on the team do not feel empowered to actually bring up, well, I didn't escalate this because it would have simply escalating it would have essentially stopped me from completing the work in the sprint. Right. I do think that's I mean, as I think through that, I want you to know that experience that you've communicated makes me think a lot about um, uh, where the responsibilities actually lie along the chain. And I've worked with a lot of big companies who I imagine have zero visibility on this kind of issue. They have zero visibility on, well, why am I not getting feedback from the development team? Where is the gap? Why did this? And take it to a bigger level, Joseph, like a Fortune 500 company who has a massive project that's a year-long project, and they get to the end of it, and that's the first time they're doing a postmortem, or one of the few first times they're doing the postmortem. You're not doing a postmortem on a piece by piece basis and making adjustments along the way, right? That is still how it goes for a lot of big companies. You cannot, it is not easy to get the attention of senior leadership or executives. And yet, at the same time, it's that same group, that senior leadership and executives, who are making the final decision on the processes and tools to get the information they need to see these projects through. If they're not getting it, because they're missing huge pieces of the whole thing. Okay, so we're headed towards kind of the towards the end of it, and I'd like to solicit y'all's feedback a little bit on what, if anything, throughout this call so far that has given you the same kind of pause and thought that Joseph just gave me. What do you guys think about escalation at this point? What are you guys thinking about it any differently?
Yeah, I think it really depends, kind of, right, the direction of the escalation, who identifies the issue. Does it go up? Does it go, is it, being pushed down to the engineers? I maybe one takeaway I have is how much of this is not really in that core engineering part of the discipline, but it's about establishing trust and relationships with people, right? And listening if somebody brings something up. So, for example, if it's an engineer that wants to talk to their manager about an escalation, that manager should always listen to the engineer and triage and if it is an issue that needs to then bubble up higher, that shouldn't necessarily then go and get attached to a name from an engineer, right? It should be owned as the team. That team should trust that, hey, we are building the best thing we can build. And then that, leader of that team should, bring that up as, hey, this is the real issue you see there. Then really interacting with that, top layer of management, right? I think there's the same need to establish that trust, so that when somebody says, hey, I need this, otherwise, I get this all the time, right? Well, I need just this one more feature, otherwise the whole thing's useless, right? So, but being able to say, hey, yeah, well, we built this, it's like 99% there. We can add the 1% little change you need, but let's put it into the regular process. Let's, release what we have now if we can, maybe, release parts of it, right? So that you can move forward, and then you make that small change, but run it through the full testing, make sure that they trust you will eventually deliver that thing, right? So that they get out of this mindset of, hey, I can ask at any time for any of the things that are maybe opinion-based, right? Maybe less so fact-based. So that, I think that trust really just goes both ways. That's maybe the main read that I kind of get out of this.
I'm just going to speak out loud here, and I'm not sure if what I'm saying holds water. It could, so we'll see. But I definitely agree with GC that there's a trust thing there. I also wonder, is it a natural thing that we experience and that you kind of have to endure in some ways, and at some points, like use the analogy of like you work out and your muscles are sore. That's just a natural part of it, and you kind of embrace it at some point and say, okay, this is just the way it is. And of course, I don't mean that to the rule, or to be thrown out into the far fringes of it should be detrimental. It should never be detrimental. But is it part of a growing pain of building that trust back and forth, or kind of self-selecting how that works?
Yeah. I can see what you're saying there, Joseph, for sure. It's we have to learn how to do these things. And obviously that the more is in place to learn to do these things earlier on. We have this. I think our industry has this this perspective that leadership skills, like a lot of the things that we've talked about today, get developed closer to when you're promoted to leadership in some way, shape, or form, whether that's you're over other people and I think that that's a mistake. I have talked to quite a few people, and I think it's a pretty broadly accepted idea of like some people will have natural leadership skills, and that those will be further developed when they are able to apply those leadership skills, as opposed to everyone has the capacity to develop what's called leadership skills, and that we should be doing that as early on as possible, even if we aren't in leadership. Because that right there is what builds that trust. People who are currently in leadership can look down and say, here's somebody who's developing skills that I recognize as a leader, without them being a leader at this point. So there is a standard in that too. I fully believe that there's a standard we can follow. It's not nebulous, right? We can sit here, we can ask the question, well, what are leadership skills? And I can tell you, it's not what a bunch of leaders would probably tell you right now. I think people don't recognize it. They're not going to sit there and go, they're not going to say things like, hey, like, let's talk about how we escalate things so that we can build this back and forth trust, right? That building the trust is a leadership skill. We do it in our personal lives. Like, people sit there and go, well, I'm going to go out on a date, right? What are you doing when you do that? You're getting to know somebody and you're building trust, because you don't know them from anybody initially, right? You're building a certain level of trust, and you build on that trust over time, right? And sometimes the growing pain there, sometimes that trust gets violated, or you are missing information, or there's a wide variety of reasons. And we deal with it in our personal lives. And I don't know about anyone on this call, and I certainly don't, really need to know, but I can tell you for a fact that there are a bunch of people who go to therapy to figure out why they have such trouble doing this. So why wouldn't we be doing that in our professional lives? We're talking about relationship development in a professional environment. So it's kind of, to me, it seems like it's the same thing. And so the other piece to this is that, like, the standard here is not to speak up more. The standard is you've got to make the situations you're in more legible, for lack of a better word, more recognizable, more concrete. We as software developers and IT professionals, we deal with the abstract and the untouchable every single day, the intangible, I should say. We have to make that more concrete. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap, and I'll give a couple minutes for you guys. Before I do that, I want to give a couple minutes for anybody to ask any questions or give any more feedback you want to give. So I will be quiet for about 30 seconds. Floor is y'all's. Jump in or raise a hand for any feedback before I close this out for the day. Okay. All right. So next session, we're going to be looking at, in 2 weeks, I'm going to be looking at kind of talking more in detail about ambiguity and focus, how to keep people moving without pretending that clarity exists, actually getting clarity and removing that ambiguity. Focus is also a great topic. I am of the opinion, and someday I will be able to prove this with statistical facts. I am of the opinion that a greater percentage, a very significant percentage of the IT profession is on the spectrum in some way, shape, or form. I know I certainly am. So, focus can be a very hard topic. It can be a very charged topic. You know, how people in business who are who can generally be more neurotypical would look at focus is not how we look at focus. And I do believe there's an answer that works for everyone and is very accommodating. I thank you guys for coming in and contributing. Really appreciate it. I love seeing everybody every couple weeks and having conversations. So thank you all very much. And I will be sending out the emails on the next session. And of course, when this session goes up for the full YouTube and all that. All right, everyone.
Thank you.
Happy May. See you in a couple weeks.
Thanks. Good seeing you all. Nice meeting you, GC.
Yeah,
Yeah,
likewise.
nice meeting you.
Nice meeting you.